Okay, let's go to the next one. Let's take a look at the next accident. It's called Davant, Louisiana, July 24th. You'll note up here it says it's not a DOI accident. This was the accident that didn't make our statistics but cost us the life of a DOI and AMD inspector pilot. The inspector pilot was down in Louisiana in the summer supporting the Deepwater Horizon oil spill response. He was down there to act as a relief pilot for one of our Bureau helicopters that was working on that mission. And in a general overview, this pilot's main responsibilities with AMD was to be a helicopter inspector pilot. His supervisor, in the broader sense, was looking to expand his capabilities and eventually, at some time down the road, have him become a fixed-wing inspector pilot as well. So while he was down in the New Orleans area, he contacted his supervisor. The supervisor was actually moving his home from Atlanta to Boise, so he wasn't sitting in his office at his desk with all those luxuries. He was on the road and asked his boss if he could get checked out in single engine C, get a float plane rating. His boss supported that, and the pilot went out to a location nearby, just south of New Orleans, where he had actually made the acquaintance of the people there when he carted them in a point-to-point manner. He carted them point-to-point, meaning he didn't have to be rated in the aircraft to give them any check rides or anything. So you kind of get the idea of what the information on the left side says, Cessna 180. It is pilot training. This is why it was not a Department of Interior accident. This was a service that we leased the training of our pilot under the authority of the flight instructor's Part 61 certificate. We weren't directing the initiation, conduct, or termination of the flight, so to speak. The damage was substantial. Our pilot did not get out of the aircraft. I'll show you some pictures in a minute about that. And the NTSB identifications at the bottom. This still only has a preliminary report on the web. If you want to go to the next page, it shows you an overview of the Gulf region and the track of tropical storm, tropical depression Bonnie. It was first a tropical storm and was later downgraded to winds of a tropical depression category. It was coming on shore right exactly where they were doing the Deepwater Horizon mission and where this pilot was going to be doing his flight training. This was for the day of the accident. I'll back up 2 days in time. He'd gotten permission verbally from his supervisor to conduct the training. 2 days prior to the mishap, he went out to the site and got his first ride. The first ride was in a Super Cub. When he went to this vendor, the vendor was used to working with civilians on limited budgets. Not that we're not on limited budgets, but he was doing everything he could to economize the training to get these guys their rating. So he put them in a Super Cub to save $100 over doing all the training in a Cessna 180. The reason why he ultimately had to go into the 180, and this will become important in a moment, is that when he went to get his check ride with the FAA inspector plus the size of our pilot would exceed the performance capabilities of the Super Cub. So for economy, we flew a couple days in the Super Cub, and then on the last day, we jumped into a new model of aircraft where we were absolutely unfamiliar with it for the purpose of getting the check ride, and that's when we had the accident. So on the first 2 days, the pilot would fly morning flight with the helicopter in support of Deepwater Horizon and go out and get a ride in the afternoon with the Super Cub on floats. And the next day, he did it in reverse sequence. He flew in the morning in the Super Cub, in the afternoon with the helicopter. On this day, it's a Saturday, because the approach of the tropical depression, the incident command, which was run by one of our bureaus, ordered that all aviation activities cease and that the helicopters be hangared for their protection. In fact, the tropical depression weakened and the weather was not severe, but it brings a point to question that when an incident command takes a proactive step to mitigate the risks, you have to think twice, or you should think twice, about going out and flying in the face of that. The weather, the actual weather as reported by the two closest remote automated weather sites, was fairly benign as far as ceilings and visibilities and temperatures and dew points and density altitudes. The one key factor, and I'll bring it up in about 2 slides, were the winds. The winds were somewhere in the range of 12 to 13 knots, and there was a quartering tailwind where he was landing, and 13 knots is the maximum crosswind for this model of aircraft on floats. So anyway, that gives you an idea of the general area. The next slide is a sectional chart, which I've overlaid the actual radar track. Again, this aircraft did not have AFF, and it wouldn't have been required because this was not a carded aircraft. It didn't need to be carded because it wasn't working for the Department of Interior. We were just getting flight training in it. So we have the radar track that shows the takeoff and the last radar hit. The time involved was very short from takeoff to landing. If someone has better eyes than I think it was under 15 minutes. And in that 15 minutes, they accomplished quite a few tasks, from, getting the aircraft started and taking off and step taxiing and climb out and a series of slow turns, steep turns, stalls, until he came down to where he was going to make his first landing. And I put this into perspective of place yourself in the pilot's situation. You're learning a new task, flying a float plane, and you're learning it in a new airplane, a Cessna 180, that you've never flown before. You don't even know where the seatbelts are. Quite literally, you don't understand the sight picture. You've never made a landing in it, not on land, not on the water. So in 14 minutes or however long it took, you're doing quite a few tasks, one after the other, to clear this airspace and go out, and your mind's probably thinking as far ahead as you can about how you're going to make your first approach. And the flight instructor, again, to economize, directed the pilot to not make a full-stop landing, but to keep the aircraft moving. If you're on a runway, you'd call it a touch and go, but here you would keep it on the step and make another takeoff. That way you don't waste any time and cost any more money. So all this is going around in the pilot's head as he makes his first approach. The numbers that are up there on that slide indicate that in about a minute, he descended at a 917 foot per minute rate of descent. Certainly not too much for an experienced pilot. He was an experienced pilot, but in helicopters, not in float planes. So a lot of things are happening real quick. The next slide is a Google Earth overview of the Ash River. If I'd gone a little bit further up into space, on the bottom left side, you would have seen the Mississippi River. The Ash River is fairly large. You'll see another photograph of that in a minute. The yellow circle marks where we believe he touched down and crashed. The X marks the spot where we found the aircraft. And it's hard for you to tell, I'm sure, but that's floating upstream. And so probably the tidal surge associated with Tropical Depression Bonnie is what pushed the aircraft upstream instead of the tide and the currents taking it down. The two big arrows show the direction of wind from the two closest RAWS stations. The direct crosswind was about 9 knots, and the quartering tailwind was between 12 and 13 knots. Recall that the maximum crosswind capability for the Cessna 180 on floats is 13. Now, if I can show you, there's a long cut, and I'm going to use the red pen thing here to highlight. This is where they had a drill rig for oil, and this long, straight, well, I can't draw it straight. It's kind of embarrassing, but boy, makes me laugh at least. The cut in the swamp was how boats could get out to that drill rig. And the first rescuer who got to the site commented on how strong the winds were right exactly at that point, as though it was a venturi for the winds that were already blowing to funnel there. And he suggested that that's possibly where the aircraft had made its final touchdown and at the last minute got caught by a stronger than normal gust of wind. The flight instructor didn't recall that. What the flight instructor recalled was that the pilot had, in his term, landed flat. Now I'm going to go to the next slide. The next slide gets an actual photograph of the Ash River looking to the southeast. And I circled again the area where we think he touched down. And back up around the bend, there'll be a little X, and that X marks the spot of where the aircraft was found the next day. So it was very flat, it was very wide, it was very open, there were no obstructions, and under other circumstances, it would have been a good place for a beginner to practice landing. This slide shows a picture of the aircraft inverted. All you see are the bottom of the floats. And I show this for a couple of reasons. This is where the actual aircraft was when the sheriffs and the FAA and the coroner went out there. That crossbar between the two floats, well, you're going to see a picture of it later, but it's only a foot or so under the water. The one in the back is just barely under the water. The water was very brackish, meaning that you couldn't see once you put your hand in the water. If you put your hand into your elbow, you wouldn't see your fingers. I've gone to another slide here that shows a side diagram of a float in the correct landing attitude. I'm not a float pilot, but I brought one with me. That's why I said we have improved our investigative process by bringing in subject matter experts from our bureaus. Now, this was an AMD pilot, but our expertise in this, we brought someone from the National Park Service. It lends an independence so that it wasn't AMD investigating AMD. This gentleman from Alaska came down and pointed out that the intent is to keep the nose up so that you land on the smallest amount of hull surface as possible. Now I've hit the button again, and now you see on the step there's a very small amount of hull creating drag in contact with the water. When the flight instructor said that he landed flat, what he meant was that the nose was pitched too far forward. But the difference between the proper attitude and a flat attitude might be as little as 3 degrees. And for a pilot on his first ever approach, thinking 1,000 different things and trying to do it right, what point of reference does he have? What happens when you land flat and you have all that hull contact with the water is you get a great degree of drag and deceleration, which rapidly multiplies and causes you to pitch further forward. I'm on the slide that now shows the side view of the aircraft. In blue at the water line is the center of buoyancy, the point at which the decelerative forces are working. And above it, quite a ways above it, in red, is the center of gravity, the point at which momentum is working. And because the center of buoyancy is forward of the center of gravity, you'll have a pitching moment. I added in a red line for thrust. Because the pilot was directed not to land to a stop, but directed to effectively make a go-around, stay on the step, and he never was on the step, he had a greater degree of thrust. And so not only was he on his first approach in an airplane that he didn't have an understanding of the sight picture with a wind condition that was at the maximum for crosswinds for a float aircraft, he lands with a flat attitude, decelerates, but he has a lot of thrust going forward and he pitches over. This photograph is as we pulled the aircraft out of the water. How much of the seat that you see closest to you is where the flight instructor was. I might mention this flight instructor had 18,000 total hours and about 5,000 in this model of aircraft, and he was the president of a company that taught people how to get out of aircrafts once they ditched. That was his side business. So he had a great deal of experience with this aircraft, landing on floats, and how to get out of an aircraft if it hit the water badly. So as he was landing, he was preparing himself to get out. Our pilot, not familiar with the right attitude, and by the way, he hadn't completed the IAT requirements, one of which was A113 for dunker training. So he probably got a briefing in the morning, according to the flight instructor, where the emergency exits were. Being a pilot, I'm sure he paid real close attention to that. I don't mean that to be sarcastic, but he's got a lot on his mind. Look at where the person's hip joint would be, where your back and your legs meet. Is that going to be real easy to get out of that seat without sliding the seat back? Look across to the far side, and you see the door handle. I'll circle the door handle. The door handle is unlocked, but latched. Could the pilot, sitting in the seat without moving the seat back, have been easily able, inverted in the dark, to reach the door handle to open it, if he knew where to put his hand in an airplane he hadn't flown before? I'm going to use the marker again. It may not be as easy to see on your screen as it is on mine, but right here I'm circling a silver reflective panel that you'd put in the windscreen to keep the heat of the sun out when you've got the aircraft parked. When these guys took off, they took the windshield screen and threw it in the back seat. When they went upside down, it came forward. When that pilot tried to escape from an aircraft he was unfamiliar with, anything that got in his way was not going to make it any easier for him to get out. Gone to the next slide, and the aircraft is now sitting back on its floats. Again, it may be a little dark in there for you to see, so I'll just zoom in for you. What you see here is the pilot was in the left seat, and around his yoke right here is a blue bag that basically contained stuff, whatever stuff they wanted. And there's a bilge pump that's stuck behind the yoke. You can see behind the seats where that windscreen cover is. What you can't see are where the life preservers are, the PFDs. They were not wearing PFDs, neither the pilot nor the co-pilot. They thought it was too hot. These particular PFDs were, according to the instructor, non-reusable. When you see the next accident presentation from John Mills, you'll see what they look like still in the case. They were not wearing shoulder harnesses. They chose not to wear the shoulder harness, the flight instructor said, because the flap handle's mounted to the floor, and anytime you reach down to get the flap handle, you can't see out of the instrument panel. If you're not wearing a shoulder harness and you pitch forward, the momentum and the fulcrum at your hips is going to cause you to move forward. It'll probably make it harder to pull back on the yoke to keep the nose up, and easier to push forward to cause it to tip over. And it's also possible that you bump your head on the glare shield, which wouldn't help your orientation as you're trying to escape an inverted aircraft that you've never gotten out of, even on dry land in your life. I'm going to summarize a couple things here. The pilot did not, the AMD pilot did not have dunker training. He was not wearing a PFD. There was not a management plan. There was not a written plan for risk management. They had not conducted flight following. They'd simply put their aircraft number up on a board in the base ops of the company, and there was no one there to watch it. There's no indication that before takeoff they'd gotten a weather briefing, but they chose to take off knowing that the incident had grounded their aircraft and told them to hangar their aircraft because of this tropical depression. Again, was not wearing shoulder harnesses either. The lap belt on the left seat was sent off to the NTSB for inspection. ELT did not activate. In this case, in the previous accident at Corvallis that I talked about, the disintegration of the aircraft, the ELT did activate, An ELT that's not connected to its antenna because the airframe's disintegrated doesn't send a signal very far. In this case, the ELT, the forces of impact were not sufficient enough to cause the ELT to go off. The only way that they got any help was that the flight instructor stood on the float and waved down this fisherman that I'm handing a patch to. This gentleman was absolutely heroic in his efforts. He dove into the submerged aircraft in pitch black 6 times. He had no idea what he was diving into. In fact, when they came up upon the scene, they actually thought it was a boat that had overturned. So he didn't know what a door looked like and how many seats and which way was front and which way was back, and it was inverted. But yet he tried 6 times, going somewhere between 3.5 and 6 feet underwater to get inside that cabin area, and ultimately was able to pull our pilot out and attempt CPR. It was just unfortunate. It was unsuccessful.